So Born Again has wrapped up, and, well, I've already made a review about that, but since I'm still feeling those Daredevil vibes, at least for the next couple weeks or so until Thunderbolts comes out, I still want to talk about The Man Without Fear. Though there are countless topics I could talk about under the umbrella that is Daredevil, I wanted to talk about the meaning behind every different costume he's worn over the years, but after a quarter of the way of me typing up that script, I found this video, making every point I was making just an echo of his. And on top of that, it's said much more succinctly than I could hope to, so probably just check that guy out. But if you're still in the mood for more Daredevil like me, stick around for now, as I want to dive into a relatively similar topic, so I can use some of the same talking points in the script and not waste all that time, but also because it's something Matt has done almost more than any other hero, though I'm not counting vague anti-heroes in that, and to my knowledge, there isn't a single video or article clearly listing off all of the times it's happened. Not that that needs to be the case for me to want to make this video, because you know I'd make it either way, but I just mainly didn't want to step on this guy's toes. Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, your nihilistic optimist, and while Matt is technically always losing it and will, in every comic of his, have his life fall apart, but I still want to take a look at the 7 times Daredevil went off the deep end, meaning every time he stepped over a line or did something he himself knew was wrong, not including every instance of that happening, because then we'd be here for a whole afternoon. With that in mind, let's dive right in, starting off with number 1. Mike Murdock, who either just made you shiver at the mention of his name or means nothing to you. If you're anything like me, then you're not the biggest fan of his, and I haven't been secretive with my dislike of him, being open with just how much I hate him with every chance I get, though that has more to do with the time that he was brought back by the reader in 2019. Not you, the reader, though. He's an actual guy in the comics whose superpower is bringing any fictional thing to life by reading it, but this particular instance of Matt ruining his life thanks to Mike began decades before, in 1967 to be exact. And the first issue introducing him starts off strong with the phrase, "Wowee, just wait till you'll meet old Matt Murdock's swingin' twin brother," slapped onto the title page. Also announcing the introduction of a new villain, Leapfrog, just below that. And in that story, Spider-Man had previously sent a letter to Matt telling him he knows his identity for convoluted reasons. But of course, before he can get to the letter, Karen and Foggy open it and seemingly, finally, discover the truth. And right as Matt's coming home from a long trip, they confront him about it and put him in a genuine bind. Seeing no escape or option of getting out of the interrogation the conversation had become, Matt desperately searches for any plausible solution they would believe, but nothing really works. Backed into a corner, Matt goes for his biggest, boldest lie yet. Amnesia? No, that'd be too dumb. Instead, a secret twin brother. It's not him that's Daredevil, after all. That would be ridiculous. He's blind. But Mike, Matt's estranged and long-lost relative who looks exactly like him, he's Daredevil. And on paper, I suppose this farce isn't the worst thing in the world, being the absolute extreme of pushing a secret identity to its limit, having the best friend and will they won't they romance character technically find out Daredevil's identity, and forming stories with them able to talk about it without actually fully revealing it. And I've already mentioned I don't like him, but I'll repeat it for those in the back that didn't hear. I'm sorry, Mike fans. I know there's not very many of you out there, but there are some. Yet I hate Mike with a burning passion. Yet with his introduction and subsequent appearances, Foggy immediately hates him, and Karen takes a begrudging liking to him. After all, for all of his playboy and loudmouth-esque faults, he's still a superhero. But after using that facade of Mike multiple times over the span of quite a long time, Matt gets deep into the lie, the layers of which keep getting more and more convoluted, requiring constant effort and upkeep on Matt's part to stop his friends from figuring out the obvious truth. Going all out in the act, Matt begins to have a little too much fun and be a little too convincing. At one point, dressing up as Thor for fun, but then getting into an altercation with the real Thor, and in a figurative sense, gets his teeth knocked in. In the meantime though, there's plenty of villains that come and go. Stiltman, as always, the Masked Marauder, even some aliens that temporarily blind the entire planet. But in that time, 2 things become clear. Foggy hates Mike, and Karen is head over heels for him, even getting upset during a time that Mike has to fake being blind for reasons, but is unable to see the new hairstyle she spent time getting done. But her and Foggy do begin to suspect the lie after too many near misses and coincidences, but it isn't until until Matt gets stuck in an endless time continuum that he decides it's gone too far. While fighting the Exterminator and his powerful henchmen, Matt blows up the building they're in and fakes Daredevil's death, thus also faking Mike's death, leaving only a tattered remnant of his costume to bolster the lie. Even though, come on, who's buying that? Everyone, I guess. But the very next issue introduces the Jester, a villain I've got a whole video about. So of course, Matt is suited back up right away. Does anyone question how Daredevil came back to life? No, not really. Everything kind of just wraps up in a nice little bow. Matt gets to pretend that all of this crap was just Mike with minimal repercussions. Really, the only thing that comes from it is Karen leaving for a time. But instead of explaining what happens to her, let's just move on to the next case of Matt going off the deep end. This being one that he can't excuse with a bold-faced lie everyone somehow believes. That being number 2, Fall from Grace, which can be found in a trade paperback and collects issues 319 to 325 from 1993 to 94. And online, there's an uncharacteristic consensus where just about everyone can agree that this whole storyline is overly convoluted and intellectual without actually having anything to say. And I don't remember loving it with my first read, but going back to make sure I even remembered this one, I was smacked in the face with how odd it was. Featuring ninjas, demons, task forces, vampires, Morbius, Venom, and just about any other character the writers decided would be a good idea to cram in. This story is dense, and not in a good way. The text is wordy, the themes are way too lofty, and I was never a fan of the new extreme look Daredevil had adopted, but that's why I'm bringing it up. In this story, a miracle drug named About Face shows up, and pretty much any Marvel character who you think might have an interest in it attempts to claim it for themselves. And I'm not even kidding, everyone shows up. I mean, Sable and her task force are probably the biggest antagonistic element, I guess, but that's not saying much. And with all of those players on the field, you'd think one of them is going to kick the crap out of Daredevil and force him to armor up. But nah, it's a villain you've probably never heard of, named the Crippler, who tears Daredevil's original suit to tatters. He manages to get it even more ripped up to the point of it basically being a loincloth when fighting Sable's task force, but I just found it funny how out of everyone, it was the Crippler. But anyway, as I said before, because practically everyone under the sun is going after the About Face drug, including some genuine threats, Matt decides to make a new uniform. Sewing and crafting it himself, I assume, he steps out the next issue in this armored Daredevil look. And let me tell ya, while wearing that suit, he gains a little bit of an edge. Though if I had to point my finger at something, I honestly just blame that new edge on the 90s obsession with making their characters edgy, rather than the character himself gaining that edge. Without fail, just about everyone had to get a flashy new suit and a high-strung, almost unstable personality. That or just getting a new face to take the mantle, all for the sake of increasing sales. For Daredevil specifically, this kind of began a decade earlier when Frank Miller revamped the character with the influential storyline Born Again, where the serious elements of the drama were prioritized and the writing was meant to entertain and deconstruct, rather than the stock standard fun superhero affair everyone was getting used to. Though if we're being real, it wasn't too long before that became the new stock standard. But of course, I can't bring up Daredevil's black armored look without also mentioning the recent flashback stories published in 2023, which saw Daredevil teaming up with other heroes and fighting villains like Hobgoblin and Sabretooth, all in a package that is infinitely less confusing than Fall from Grace. Though, if I had to give one positive to that, this cover from its prologue is an undeniable banger. But with that said, let's move on to number 3, the psychological torture he puts Bullseye through for retribution. As you probably know, Bullseye had been a recurring villain for Daredevil since 1976 with the villain's introduction in Daredevil number 131, but that dynamic began to change drastically in 1979 in issue number 161, culminating in an interaction that is quite possibly the best Daredevil thing ever in issue 191, which I guess kind of led up to one another in a conspiracy theory kind of way with a 3, 6, and 9. But anyway, after facing loss after loss, Bullseye kidnaps Black Widow to figure out a weakness of Daredevil's, but only proves how relentless Matt is and makes Daredevil unbeatable in Bullseye's eyes. No joke there, it just sounded weird coming out of my mouth. But after another dramatic loss, Bullseye snaps. And whether it's because of this, or perhaps something Bullseye always saw in some shape, it's revealed that Bullseye sees everyone as Daredevil. a delusion that causes him to go on a massive killing spree. But it's not that sets Matt off. He stops him and puts him in jail, even getting him the medical help he needs because, spoiler alert, Bullseye was experiencing that psychosis because he had a brain tumor. Even much later on in Miller's run, after Bullseye kills Elektra, Daredevil doesn't kill him. In classic hero fashion, he tries to save Bullseye from falling to his death. But sometimes villains got a villain, and he refuses the help, falling to his demise. Except he didn't die from the fall, and was instead crippled. And though there are still more instances of going too far with Daredevil and Bullseye that I'll bring up in just a bit, this right here is what made me want to add it to the list. Daredevil number 191 of Frank Miller's run. For the previous cases, I'll admit I wasn't the biggest fan of. At best, they felt like brief moments where the characters kinda just forgot who they were, and at worst felt like complete character assassinations. But this I genuinely love. Seriously, before I break down this single issue, if you're even kinda interested in reading it, go do so. Pause the video and then come back. And I assume you just did it, so let's dive in. Daredevil's always had that dark side to him, and whether it was for Born Again, this, or any other story, Frank Miller knew how to highlight that darkness without it just becoming the story. But this chapter opens up with Daredevil taking a gun to his temple and pulling the trigger, and he does the same to a bedridden Bullseye, revealing that they're playing Russian roulette. And because Bullseye is a paraplegic at that time, not even able to speak, Daredevil just points the gun to him and pulls the trigger each time, and Bullseye must watch everything unfold without any control of the situation. The whole time intercutting back and forth with Matt pulling the trigger on himself and Bullseye, and the story of why he's there in the first place. That being snippets of Daredevil attempting to help out a psychologically abused boy named Charlie, who happens to be a massive Daredevil fan. During that time, Matt is representing Charlie's father in court and quickly realizes he is not innocent in the slightest. So as Daredevil, he dishes out some justice in front of Charlie, and Charlie doesn't take it well. His already anxious self spirals out until all he can do is watch a news recording of Daredevil fighting Bullseye over and over again. Registering the responsibility that he failed, Matt also begins to spiral, wondering what he's even doing, questioning exactly what kind of effect he has by putting on a bright costume and beating people up. Is he teaching the public that good always wins? That crime doesn't pay? That the cavalry is always on its way? None of that? The ultimate question that he must grapple with is whether he's fighting violence or teaching it, or should he be thinking about environmental factors instead? Of course, there are an infinite amount of things to think about, but Matt, being eternally guilty about his dad, immediately thinks about fathers. Some people will always be disturbed no matter what you do, but can, say, a good father have stopped Bullseye from becoming Bullseye? Diving into how everyone, even the best of us, has good and evil in them, and are influenced by those infinite environmental factors every minute of every day. Of course, none of that excuses any of Bullseye's actions over the years, and if I'm honest, some people like that, who constantly prove that they'll never learn the value of a life, deserves to be put down, and probably more. That being said, playing Russian roulette with him while he helplessly watches on, pissing his pants if he could, is maybe a bit too far. So if you read this anything like I did, the internal conflict of wanting to see Matt pull the trigger on him, and knowing that he won't because he's a hero, but also because comics need recurring villains and Bullseye's too good to kill off. But getting to the final round of roulette, you're not too sure that'll be the case. And you, the reader, not the character, this time it's you, if you've been counting, know that this shot has to have the bullet in it. And slowly, panel by panel, as Matt explains why darkness can be seen in all of us sometimes, pulls the trigger on Bullseye, who doesn't react, he literally can't, but I like to think there's genuine fear in his eyes here. It's a messed up thought and the sole reason why I felt like adding it to this list in the first place, but one that gives me chills every time I remember it. And there's plenty of other messed up instances of a line being crossed, one where that line is much more clearly stepped on, such as when Daredevil carved Bullseye's symbol into his skull as if he was Brad Pitt in Inglourious Bastards, or him killing him in the same fashion Bullseye killed Elektra during the Shadowland comic, something that might come up again later. So I'm just gonna put a pin in that and move on to number 4, romantically getting with a villain Typhoid Mary for the sole reason of putting her in an institution. Typhoid Mary, if you weren't already aware, is a somewhat popular Daredevil villain known for low-level psychic and fire-starting powers, high-level fighting skills, and the use of poison. sometimes. As a child, she also had two personalities. One of Mary, a gentle and sickly little girl, and one of Typhoid, a murderous and chaotic terror. She'd get more as time went on, but if you hadn't heard of her before now, that's all you really need to know. And when I say that Matt tricked her into getting psychological help, it doesn't sound so bad, but once you put into context that Mary had spent her entire childhood being locked up in an institution, experimented and tested on in all sorts of ways, it starts to make sense why it's such a drastic betrayal. But this all begins in issue number 254 of Frank Miller's run, where Kingpin manages to employ Typhoid Mary to seduce Matt after he reveals to her that he and Daredevil are one and the same. And it might be because of the subtle mind control she's manipulating Matt with, but they immediately hit it off. Though it does help that she's assisting with a newly blind kid that Matt was already trying to comfort and coach. At the time, Matt and Karen were finally together after decades of having that will they won't they dynamic. But in the heat of the moment, Matt cheats on Karen with Mary. And not just that, he does it in front of that blind kid, who faces plenty of neglect because of Matt's new obsession with Mary. While the sweet, gentle side of Mary is legitimately falling for Matt, the Typhoid side of her continues to rig the entire seduction to keep pulling him closer, despite him knowing that he's backstabbing Karen more with every step. But Matt's such a pest when it comes to having chemistry and an eventual romance with every female around him that I believe he would have done this with or without mind control. I mean, dude cheated on Mila, and he did that while he was married to her, something that honestly deserves to be on this list as well, but I figured if I was going to put one romance-themed time Matt crossed a line, it had to be Typhoid Mary. And as Matt is busy two-timing her, Karen can feel their relationship falling apart from minute one, which genuinely hurts to see. But before Matt ever has the time to explain his actions or redeem himself, he's ambushed by a handful of his enemies, including Bushwhacker, Bullet, Ammo, and more, who were all extorted by Mary into fighting Daredevil again for one reason or another. And after they absolutely pulp him, Mary drops Daredevil off of a bridge, seemingly killing him, which is fun and all, but of course doesn't stick, and Daredevil eventually gets back to feeling on top of the world, as he always does. But just a short while later, in issue number 297, when out on patrol, Daredevil finds Mary and decides to stop her, and he does this by making her drop her guard, kissing her, and eventually luring her to an apartment in what is nothing more than a sadistic trap. He calls some medical professionals and leaves her to be picked up by them, embarrassing Mary in such an extreme way it's hard to justify in any sense of the word. But rather than dwelling on this, because it is a seriously messed up thing to do, I'll just transition right along to number 5, the time Daredevil became Kingpin, which chances are you already know occurs in Bendis's run starting in 1998, and a lot of Daredevil's seriousness and depth is attributed to Miller's masterful writing, featuring some of the most seminal stories Daredevil's ever had, but I've always associated his dark period with this run. Some of the most notable elements include a tabloid newspaper vying for the Daily Bugle's top spot by outing Matt Murdock as Daredevil, an outing so public it upends his life and threw him into endless legal battles. During that time, his newlywed life also goes from one turbulent patch to another, with her being manipulated by Mr. Fear, as well as Matt just straight up cheating on her at one point, which I mentioned before and is terrible in and of itself, but as despicable as it is, I wanted to include it as an element of the downward tailspin Matt was undergoing at the time. But a large portion of the conflict with Fisk culminates in issue 50 of that run, which sees Daredevil fighting Kingpin in an attempt to stop him from reclaiming the power he had lost after he hit rock bottom, which included him going blind for a time, but he had reconstructive surgery and was back, bigger and badder than ever. And during that fight is when it occurs to Daredevil just how tired of this charade he was. Going back and forth over and over, it was time for a change. Beating Kingpin to a paste and knocking him out with a serious blow, Matt then proceeds to crash his body through a window of a seedy nightclub, threatening that anyone stepping out of line would get the same, and telling those criminals to spread the word that a new Kingpin was in charge. All the while in the Daredevil suit, but without the mask, simply not caring that people were seeing his face because the secret was already basically out. And he never outright says that he is now the Kingpin, but states that anyone selling drugs, robbing, or engaging in any any dangerous crime that threatened lives in his city would sorely regret it. He also chooses to say that if anyone couldn't control themselves or live by those rules, to just go somewhere else far away, which doesn't solve anything at all and just pushes the problem onto someone else's doorstep. But Matt's kind of in a blind rage at this point. Thinking it through wasn't his priority. In the moment, he believes what he is doing is right, and it does make sense in a very filtered point of view, but it's obvious Matt is only doing this because he's in pain. The next storyline that follows directly after is a David Mack jaw-dropper about Echo, and if you haven't heard of Mack's work before, please go check him out. As you can see, his stories are gorgeous and surreal, but 6 issues later, probably to give Bendis and Maleev a break, it dives right back into the story, King of Hell's Kitchen, flashing forward a whole year where Ben Urich explains that the period of time that followed was downright terror, experiencing one of the worst, most bloodthirsty attacks on the New York criminal world. Described as a streak of unparalleled violence striking the shadows of the city, low-life thugs were completely convinced to leave their life of crime behind. Being only Daredevil at the time, the socialite lawyer only resurfaced after he was sure every ounce of degeneracy had been squeezed out of Hell's Kitchen. And it goes so well, Matt is asked to be the Democratic nominee for the mayor of New York. Of course, not everyone's happy, and Luke Cage calls to meet up with him at a park. But upon arrival, Matt finds a handful of his superhero friends waiting to ambush him with an intervention of sorts. With Cage, there's Peter Parker, Doctor Strange, and Reed Richards, all of whom have had a genuine relationship with Matt, but no fond memories with these friends will sway Matt into stopping. And in a rare moment of self-actualization, Matt admits that becoming the de facto leader for the New York underground is taking his stance as a defender too far, yet refuses to stand down, because for all the morality-based arguments in the world, they can't dispute the fact that what Daredevil was doing was working. Matt even pleads with each of them to do the same. Peter taking over Queens, Luke taking Harlem, Reed and the Fantastic Four taking Manhattan, and Doctor Strange taking the Village. A ridiculous idea that he's instantly called out for, but one that Matt wholeheartedly believes will be the most effective way in saving lives. Unfortunately, the conversation doesn't go too well and ends abruptly with Matt just walking away while Strange is about to launch into an ancient proverb. After getting attacked and needing to go to the night nurse for medical attention, Matt admits that a lot of this, becoming Kingpin, even getting married, it was all a last-ditch attempt to gain more control over his spiraling life. A life that had been going downhill ever since he lost Karen. And by issue 59, Matt has fully realized and acknowledged that he's gone too far and needs to, somehow, walk back the disastrous ideology he had adopted. And while there's still plenty of room in his life to still spiral a little bit further, Matt's momentary certainty that being a crime lord would be a solution to his problems wrapped up by the end of issue 59, and he was back to teaming up with his old buddies. Unfortunately, that chummy and neighborly atmosphere wouldn't last, with Daredevil's return to being an edgy introvert in a later crossover storyline in 2010, that being number 6, Shadowland. And none of this one counts, I think, because Matt was being possessed, but I'm still putting it on the list. Why? It's an often forgot storyline that might just inspire a future arc in Born Again. Though when I look at the set photos of Season 2, which has Daredevil dripped out to the nines in a painted black suit with red touches underneath from where the paint didn't cover it entirely, as well as the double Ds, it is clear that that suit is just being pulled from Charles Soule's run, which saw Daredevil in a relatively similar black suit. And though there are minor differences in those looks, it's easy to confuse the two. But if you look closely, the one defining trait of Matt's Shadowland look is the horns, because Daredevil is almost always depicted as having short baby horns, which have become synonymous with him. Unlike Batman's ears, which change in length depending on the artist, Daredevil's horns almost never change, the only time that they have being in Shadowland. And there's not much explanation behind why they get bigger, aside from reading between the lines and understanding that the demon possessing Matt is changing his appearance little by little until the demonic features being placed onto him are unmistakable. But putting the look aside, the story sees Daredevil becoming the leader of the Hand. And it's not the only time that would happen, but in this particular instance, Matt keeps the group in New York and attempts to use them as a force for good, entrusting each deadly deadly ninja with the responsibility of watching over the city, something that anyone with half a brain cell would know was a bad idea, not just because the Hand has some evil leaders still asserting their control within the group, unbeknownst to Matt, but also just because it's the Hand. They're like the League of Shadows in that they're constantly promising peace and order, but only ever delivering the opposite. But for some reason, Matt trusts them and decides to construct a whole Eastern-styled block in New York, declaring order and controlling through fear. And it's the classic villain storyline of ruling and creating order, but at the cost of changing the streets of New York into an authoritarian police state where anyone speaking out is silenced one way or another. Of course, this happens to be the case in New York at least once a month, whether that be because of Kingpin, Doom, or some other random villainous cabal. But this time, it's similar to the case before, of Daredevil becoming his own version of Kingpin, ruling with fear and mistaking that quiet for peace. And Matt is acting in his classic sanctimonious and self-righteous way, believing what he's doing is right, with the conflict being relatively gray, but Daredevil very clearly crosses his own line by killing Bullseye, something that could be justified in a certain point of view, but with this being much more vindictive, it's clear Matt isn't really thinking about the consequences, or just straight up isn't in control. It's up in the air which he is in that particular moment, but I'm willing to bet Matt consciously killed Bullseye, but lost himself to the beast because of it. Maybe that was explained and I'm spelling out the obvious though, but getting to the bottom of that isn't nearly as important as getting to the last case of Daredevil crossing a line, which is number 7, Zdarsky's run, and by that I do just mean essentially the whole run. As I said in the intro to this video, Daredevil is always crashing out, going off the deep end at least once during each and every run of his. But what I especially love about this recent comic is how it starts out with Daredevil at his lowest and just keeps taking him further down. And this was a recent enough storyline that I remember reading it as it was coming out and straight up not believing its jumping off point, that being that Daredevil accidentally killed a guy as he was stopping a small-time robbery. Thinking it was a hoax, I waited quite a long time for a reveal that it was all orchestrated by some mastermind villain. But nah, Matt actually killed a guy. And so, to set things right in his eyes, Daredevil allows himself to be tried and put in prison. He does this all wearing a mask, and I still don't understand how he pulled that off legally, but there is some sort of explanation. Not too much happens while he's in jail, after all. It's the second time Matt had served a sentence, the first being much more eventful in my opinion, but seeing him venomized and fighting off control from a symbiote during Null's invasion of New York was fun. Much earlier on, Matt also proves how unstable he could be by taking some of the Punisher's guns and absolutely wrecking shop, and in the next arc, yet again leads the Hand. Of course, this time it wasn't nearly as over the line as the time he led them in Shadowland, but it still wasn't very heroic. It's also during this storyline that he is forced to go up against Spider-Man, US Agent, and multiple other key Marvel players who are there to take Daredevil in some way or another. But I don't want to say everything about this run simply because I think it'd be a better idea to just tell you to read it instead. So please, just like the Roulette chapter, if you're even slightly interested, go check it out. Besides, this video is long enough already. And with that said, those are the instances in the comics where Daredevil went off the deep end. Did I miss anything? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.